Worst part, my mother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind where she was embarrassed and trying to cover it. She genuinely thought it was funny. My brother-in-law had just told a room full of people, his business partners, his golf friends, his wife's colleagues, that I played with dirt for a living. And my mother stood right there beside him, wine glass in hand, and laughed like he'd said something charming. I was 31 years old. I had driven 4 hours from Kelowna to be there. I was wearing the nicest blazer I owned, which honestly wasn't saying much because most of my wardrobe had seen the inside of a work truck. But I had tried. I had actually tried. My sister's name is Philippa. Everyone calls her Pip, which has always suited her, small, bright, a little sharp around the edges. She married Donovan 3 years ago at a vineyard in the Okanagan that cost more than my first truck. Donovan works in commercial real estate development. He has opinions about wine, strong opinions, and he shares them at volume. I run a landscaping and land breeding company out of the interior of British Columbia. I started it when I was 24 with a second-hand bobcat, a trailer, and about $11,000 I had saved working summers since I was 16. We now do residential and commercial contracts across 3 municipalities. We had 6 employees. Last year we grossed a little over $800,000. Nobody in my family knew that last part. I had never told them. It never felt like the right moment, or maybe I just never trusted what they would do with the information. My mother had a way of taking good news and turning it into ammunition. If I had a good year, she'd find a way to bring up Pip's kitchen renovation or Donovan's latest deal and make the comparison feel like a verdict. So I kept quiet. I showed up to family events in my regular clothes. I drove my work truck. I let the assumptions sit there. But that night, standing in the corner of Pip and Donovan's new house in West Kelowna, the one they'd just finished building, the one Donovan kept calling the forever home every 15 minutes like it was a catchphrase, I started to understand that the assumptions had grown into something much worse than I'd realized. Donovan had been announced as a partner in a major development group earlier that week. That was the reason for the party. About 40 people were crammed into the open concept main floor, and Donovan was working the room like a politician on election night. I had arrived late because I'd had a client meeting run over, and when I walked in, my mother greeted me with, "Oh good, you made it. Try not to talk too much about the digging business, okay? These are important people." I smiled. I got a drink. I found a spot near the kitchen island and watched. What I noticed, once I started paying attention, was that something was off. Donovan was charming. He was always charming, but there was a tightness around his eyes when certain people approached him, the kind of tightness that comes from math you're hoping no one else is doing. I noticed he excused himself from 2 separate conversations when money came up directly. I noticed that the couple near the fireplace, the older man in the grey blazer and his wife, were watching him the same way I was, not warmly. I didn't know what I was looking at yet. I just knew I was looking at something. I ended up talking to the man in the grey blazer. His name was Alastair. He was maybe 60, calm, had the kind of unhurried manner that usually means someone has nothing left to prove. His wife, whose name I didn't catch, excused herself after a few minutes, and he and I just stood there, comfortable in the quiet. He asked me what I did. I told him. He didn't flinch, didn't pivot to someone more interesting. He asked how the dry summer had affected ground conditions in the interior, and I realized he actually knew something about it. He mentioned he had a property up near Summerland. We talked for a while. At some point, he said carefully, "How long has your brother-in-law been in development?" I told him about 8 years. He nodded slowly. "And he's always worked in the Okanagan market?" I said mostly yes, some projects in Kamloops. He said, the way people do when they're confirming something they already suspected. I didn't ask, but I filed it away. The moment that changed everything happened about an hour later. Donovan gathered everyone for a little toast. He talked about vision and risk and reward. He talked about his partners, his team. He talked about Pip, called her his rock, and she beamed. Then someone asked him to introduce family, and he swept his arm toward my mother and me standing together, and he said, "And of course, this is our family corner." My mother-in-law and Pip's little sister, who, he paused for effect, and I saw him decide to go for it, keeps busy moving dirt around the Okanagan. She's our resident outdoor enthusiast. A few people laughed, politely. My mother said she loved the outdoors, always has since she was small. Like that explained everything. Like that was a complete sentence about a person's life. I smiled. I raised my glass. I let it go. But I looked across the room and caught Alastair's eye, and he gave me the smallest nod, like he understood something about that moment that most people in the room didn't. I drove home that night, and I thought about my father. Dad had been the one who taught me to read a site. He was a civil engineer, retired, and he had spent 30 years working on infrastructure projects across BC. He was the one who, when I was 12, handed me a set of grading plans and said, "Tell me what you see." He was the one who took me to job sites on weekends while Pip stayed home and did dance rehearsals. He had always understood what I was doing and why. Dad lived alone now in the house where Pip and I grew up, in West Kelowna, about 20 minutes from Pip and Donovan's place. He was 70, healthy, sharp. He still read the engineering journals. He called me every Sunday. Except he hadn't called the previous Sunday, or the one before that. I had called him both times and he picked up, but something was different. His voice had a flatness to it. He said he was fine, just tired, just busy. I asked, busy with what? And he said he'd been helping Donovan with some paperwork. Just some administrative things, he said. Donovan needs a co-signer on a few things. You know how it is. I said I didn't, actually. What things? He got vague. Just property stuff. It's fine, Sloane. Don't fuss. Sloane, that's me. I am not a fusser by nature. I spend my days dealing with soil conditions and drainage problems and municipal permit offices, none of which reward fussing. But something in my father's voice that night had sat wrong in me. The way a grade sits wrong when you're standing on it. You can't always see it, but your body knows. The morning after the party, I called my father's bank. Not to get information. I couldn't do that without his consent. I called because I wanted to understand what kinds of documents would allow someone to co-sign on a development loan in BC and what the implications were for the co-signer. The person I spoke to was professional and gender, but what she described was enough to make me sit down. A co-signer on a commercial development loan isn't just a reference, they're liable. If the primary borrower defaults, the co-signer's assets can be seized. That includes property. That includes savings. That includes pension funds. My father owned his house outright. He had a defined benefit pension from his years in the public sector. He had RRSPs he'd been contributing to for 40 years. I needed to know what he had signed. I called him that afternoon and I asked him directly. I said, "Dad, I need you to pull out whatever paperwork Donovan gave you and read me the top of the first page." He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Stone, it's fine. Donovan explained everything. It's just to help him access a credit facility. It doesn't affect me unless." "Unless what, Dad?" More quiet. He said it's just a formality. He said these kinds of arrangements are standard in development. I said, "Can you send me a photo of the documents?" He said he wasn't sure where he put them. I said, "Dad, please." He sent them that evening. 3 documents. One was a guarantee agreement on a $340,000 line of credit through a private lender, not a chartered bank. One was an authorization allowing Donovan access to a joint investment account my father had apparently opened with him in the last 6 months, an account I had known nothing about. The third was a letter signed by my father supporting Donovan's application to refinance a commercial property with a personal guarantee attached. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I called my cousin Felicity, who is a paralegal in Vancouver. Felicity is 7 years older than me, and she has spent her career watching people get taken apart in civil proceedings. She's not dramatic about these things. When I read her the summary of what I was looking at, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, don't say anything to anyone yet. Don't let your dad say anything either. Can you get the originals?" I said I would try. The next 2 weeks were the most methodical of my life. I drove to my father's house and went through his filing cabinet with him. What we found was worse than the 3 documents he'd sent me. There were 2 more guarantee agreements I hadn't seen. There was a transfer of funds confirmation showing $60,000 moved out of the joint account, my father's $60,000, in 4 separate transactions over 8 months. There was a document that my father did not remember signing, a limited power of attorney over the joint account, dated from the previous January. My father looked at that last document for a long time. He said, "I don't remember this." I said, "I know." He said, "He brought things to me sometimes in the evenings. I was tired," he explained them. He paused. Pip was always there. She didn't seem worried. I didn't say anything about Pip right then. I didn't know yet what she knew and what she didn't. I wasn't ready to make that assumption. Felicity connected me with a solicitor she trusted, a woman named, well, I've agreed not to use her name here, but she was in her 50s. She wore practical shoes, and she had the energy of someone who had seen every version of this particular story and was no longer surprised by any of them. She reviewed everything and confirmed what Felicity had suspected. The power of attorney was the critical document. If it was valid, Donovan had had legal access to that account for 9 months. If it wasn't, if my father had not been fully informed of what he was signing, that was a different matter entirely. She said there were 2 paths. The civil path, recovering the funds, voiding the guarantee agreements, protecting my father's remaining assets before any of Donovan's development projects went sideways, and the other path, which she described quietly and didn't elaborate on, which involved a call to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. She asked me which I wanted to pursue. I said I wanted to protect my father first. We'd see about the rest. The thing about doing something like this quietly is that you have to keep showing up to normal life in the meantime. I had a crew doing a major grading job in Peachland. I had 2 new client estimates to complete. I had a meeting with the city of Kelowna about a drainage contract we were bidding on. I drove to sites, I checked grades, I ate lunch in my truck, I called my dad every evening. My mother called once during that time. She wanted to know if I was coming to Donovan and Pip's housewarming dinner. Apparently the party had been the public celebration, and there was also family dinner, smaller, the following month. I said I'd be there. She said, "Try to dress up a little this time. Donovan's colleagues might be there." I said I'd do my best. What my mother didn't know, and what Donovan definitely didn't know, was that Alastair had called me. He'd gotten my number through a mutual contact, a property owner in Summerland who I'd done site work for, who apparently knew Alastair through a business association. Alastair called on a Tuesday morning while I was at the Peachland site, and I stood on a hillside in my work boots and listened to him explain that he was one of 3 investors who had put money into a development project of Donovan's in West Bank, and that they had recently become concerned about where the project funds had gone. He said they had engaged a forensic accountant. He said the accountant had found several irregularities. He said they were at the stage where they were considering their legal options. I told him about my father. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I think we should meet." We met at a coffee place in downtown Kelowna, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. The kind of place Donovan would never be caught in because it wasn't impressive enough. Alastair brought the forensic accountant whose name was Terence, who was small and quiet and who had a laptop full of spreadsheets that he turned toward me with the calm confidence of someone showing you something irrefutable. What Donovan had been doing, Terence explained, was layering. He had been moving money between the project account, his personal account, and a numbered company he'd registered in Alberta. in amounts and sequences designed to obscure the source and destination. He had been using personal guarantees, including my father's, to access credit he then funneled into a lifestyle that had no relationship to any actual development progress. The West Bank project was behind by 18 months. The site had barely been touched. I thought about Donovan at the party, the tightness around his eyes, the toast about vision and risk and reward. I thought about my father at his kitchen table, not remembering a document yet apparently signed. I thought about my mother's laugh. I told Terence and Alastair everything I had. I sent them copies of all the documents from my father's filing cabinet. Felicity connected my father's solicitor with Alastair's legal team. Within a week, there were two parallel processes running: the investor group's civil action and a referral to the RCMP. I still had to go to the family dinner. I had considered not going. My father's solicitor said it was probably fine, that nothing was going to happen immediately, that these processes take time. Felicity said I should go and act normal. Alastair said the same thing. I dressed up, not for Donovan's colleagues, for myself. It was a Sunday. Pip had made her good roast chicken, the one with the herbs she grows in pots on the deck. My mother brought an Agra Riesling and talked about the label for 7 minutes. Donovan was in a good mood, expansive, full of plans. He talked about the West Bank project. He talked about the next project. He talked about growth and timing and the particular genius of knowing when to move. Dad was quiet. I sat beside him and we talked about the drainage contract, about a problem we'd had on the Peachland job with the retaining wall backfill. He looked better than he had in weeks, actually. He'd been sleeping properly since we'd started working with the solicitor. Something had lifted. At some point after dinner, Donovan refilled everyone's wine and said something to me. He was in a good enough mood that he decided to be magnanimous about it. He said, "You know, Sloane, for what it's worth, I respect the hustle, the outdoor business. It's honest work." He said honest work the way people say it when they mean the opposite. I looked at him. I said, "Thank you, Donovan." I said nothing else. My mother got me alone in the kitchen and said she was proud of me for being here, for being a good sport, for not making things awkward. She said Pip was happy, and that was what mattered. I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She looked at me with that particular expression she has, the one that means she's preparing to be disappointed. I said, "Dad has been helping Donovan financially, a lot, without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. I've been working with a solicitor and some other people to sort it out." I paused. "It's going to become known, probably. I wanted you to hear it from me first." She stared at me. She said, "What does that mean, sort it out?" I said, "It means recovering what Dad lost, and making sure Donovan can't access any more of it." She said very quietly, "Pip doesn't know." I said, "I don't know what Pip knows." She sat down on the kitchen stool. She set her wine glass down. For a moment, she looked every one of her years. She said, "You should have told me sooner." I thought about the party, the laugh. I said, "I'm telling you now." It took 4 months. The RCMP investigation moved slowly at first and then quickly. Donovan was formally charged the following spring: fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and 3 additional counts related to the investor funds. He was released on conditions he surrendered his passport. The civil process recovered most of my father's money. Not all of it. $60,000 in transferred funds is harder to recover than encumbrances on assets. But the guarantee agreements were voided, the joint account was dissolved, and a lien was placed on the West Bank property pending the legal proceedings. My father's pension and RRSP were never touched. Pip called me the week after the charges became public. She cried. She said she hadn't known. I don't know, to this day, exactly how much of that is true. I believe she didn't know the details. I believe she had made herself not look too closely. That's its own thing, and it's between her and whatever she can live with. My mother called me separately. She said she was sorry. Those 2 words cost her something, I could tell. She said it anyway. I drove to my father's house on a Saturday in May, and we sat on his back deck and drank coffee, and watched the light move across the hills the way it does in the Okanagan in the morning, all gold and specific. He said, "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called me when you were ready." He said, "How did you know something was wrong?" I said, "You sounded tired in a way that wasn't about being tired." He looked at the hills for a while. Then he said, "I always thought that about you, that you hear the things people don't say." I thought about being 12 years old, holding a set of grading plans. I thought about all the times I had stood on a piece of land and felt the grade before I could see it. I thought about Alastair's face across a room full of people, the small nod that said he saw it too. Some people build things by making noise. They make toasts and they talk about vision and they fill rooms with the sound of their own certainty. Some of us just watch the land. We figure out where the water wants to go and we make sure it gets there safely. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and in the end, real is the only thing that holds. I still think about my father sitting at his kitchen table holding that power of attorney document, saying he didn't remember signing it. That image hasn't left me. It probably won't. There's something people don't talk about enough when it comes to situations like this one, the way it creeps. Donovan didn't walk into my father's life and take everything at once. He took it slowly, in small amounts, on tired evenings, with my sister standing nearby looking unbothered. That's how these things work. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with 100 quiet ones that no one thinks to question because the person doing it is family, and we've been taught that family means trust. What got my father out of it wasn't luck. I want to be honest about that. It was the fact that he had raised someone who knew how to pay attention, and that when something felt wrong, she didn't talk herself out of it to keep the peace. That matters. I could have told myself I was overreacting. I could have decided it wasn't my place. There were about 15 moments in those first 2 weeks where the easier thing would have been to let it go. I didn't, and it wasn't because I'm particularly brave. It was because I'd learned, standing on job sites since I was a teenager, that ignoring a problem in the ground doesn't make it go away. It just means the damage gets worse before anyone deals with it. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on a resume and doesn't get mentioned at parties. It's the kind that notices when something is off before you can name it, when my dad's voice sounded tired in the wrong way, when Donovan's eyes tightened during a conversation about money, when Alastair looked at me from across a room and nodded like he recognized something. That noticing, learning to trust it, learning to follow it instead of override it, is the thing that actually changed how this ended. And then there's the part that takes longer, the grinding, undramatic part. Getting the documents, reading them, calling Felicity, finding the solicitor, driving to sites every day like nothing was happening while simultaneously dismantling a fraud that had been running for the better part of a year. Nobody saw that part. Nobody toasted it. It was just work. That's what most of the important things turn out to be. I don't feel triumphant about how it ended. I feel tired in a way that has mostly passed, and relieved in a way that hasn't. My father has his house. His pension is intact. He calls me every Sunday again, and the flatness is gone from his voice. My mother said sorry. That cost her something real, and I accepted it. What I keep coming back to is this. I spent years letting my family's opinion of me sit there unchallenged, assuming that saying nothing was the same as being above it. It isn't. Silence can look like confidence from the outside, but sometimes it's just avoidance. What actually helped? What helped my dad? What helped me was being willing to look at the thing directly, to call it what it was, to do the unglamorous work of fixing it even when no one would ever know you were doing it. That's the only version of integrity I understand, not the kind you perform at a party. The kind that shows up on a Tuesday morning on a muddy hillside with a phone full of bad news and deals with it anyway.